James and his team of black volunteers were arrested by a police officer who mistook their assistance at an animal shelter as a threat to society. What began as a typical day of volunteer work quickly turned into a nightmare. Bystanders captured the unjust arrest on video, and the story spread like wildfire across social media, sparking a wave of outrage. But just how far will this racist officer go, and what secrets will unravel on the path to truth? The unfolding events will shock even the most experienced among us. But let's return to the beginning. James, the main character, is a 40-year-old black activist who has dedicated his life to animal welfare and volunteering at the local shelter. He lives in a small town where, despite a facade of tolerance, racial prejudice remains deeply ingrained. For James, volunteering is not only a chance to help homeless animals, but also a way to inspire young people. He often invites teenagers from his neighborhood to learn about care and compassion. One morning, James and his volunteer team, which includes 5 black teenagers, arrive at the shelter. They clean the grounds, care for the animals, and prepare the shelter for visitors. Their work is crucial to the shelter, and they feel they are making a meaningful contribution to the community. Suddenly, a police car arrives, and a middle-aged white officer, Sergeant Blake, steps out. He looks displeased and hostile, watching James and the teens intently. Blake claims he received a call from a local resident who saw a group of black youths near the shelter and assumed they might be troublemakers. Blake approaches James, squinting at him, and rudely demands an explanation without any greeting. James, trying to remain calm, explains that he is a volunteer and that the young people with him are there to help. He says they're there to care for the animals and assures Blake they have the shelter's permission. Blake isn't listening, though. Instead, he accuses James and the teens of disturbing the peace. James tries to reason with him, but Blake insists that the entire group show their IDs. One of the teens, Marcus, nervously searches for his ID in his pocket and accidentally drops it. Blake takes this as a sign of disrespect. Suddenly, the situation escalates. The officer demands that everyone line up and stand still, threatening to arrest them as if they were a real danger. Words are exchanged and Blake pulls out the handcuffs. James, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, attempts to explain that there's a misunderstanding and that they're willing to cooperate, but Blake insists he's just doing his job. Passers-by begin to stop and record the incident on their phones. Several people shout that they know James and that he's a shelter volunteer. One of the teens, sensing the danger of the situation, quietly starts recording on his own phone to document what's happening. Blake arrests the entire group, and despite the growing crowd of witnesses, he remains certain he's in the right. James feels a growing sense of dread, but knows that resisting now could be dangerous. Instead, he tries to reassure the teens, who stand in frightened silence. Realizing the situation is becoming tense, James remains as composed as possible. He explains to Sergeant Blake that they have permission from the shelter owners to be there. However, Blake isn't interested in listening. He continues interrogating each team member, asking sharp questions as if trying to catch them in a lie. Marcus tries to explain that they're volunteers there to help the animals, but Blake cuts him off, saying he's tired of seeing them loitering around and causing trouble in the area. Frustrated, James tries to assert his right to explain, but the officer threatens to arrest him for failing to comply with a lawful order. Meanwhile, a crowd has gathered, and some people who recognize James voice their disapproval. An elderly woman in the crowd yells that James has been helping at the shelter for years and is a respected community member. Blake ignores her, insisting he has evidence and that everyone had better stay out of it or face serious consequences. As the teens continue to stand nervously, one of them, Danny, notices a bystander filming the scene. He quietly starts his own recording, hoping it might help if the situation escalates further. Blake then begins handcuffing James, shocking the crowd, who demand explanations. Remaining calm, James tells the teens to stay still and not to intervene. He understands that resisting could only make things worse, so he tries to set an example of restraint. At that moment, the shelter director, Mrs. Rachel, a middle-aged white woman who has known James for a long time, arrives. Surprised by what she sees, she demands an explanation from Blake. Mrs. Rachel tells Blake that James is a volunteer and that he and his team have permission to be on the shelter premises. She explains that they're dedicated helpers and asks him to stop the arrests. Blake, however, confidently asserts his authority and says he believes they're suspects. Under pressure from Mrs. Rachel and the growing crowd, Blake becomes irritated. He steps back, warning Mrs. Rachel that she could be charged with interference with a police officer if she doesn't move away. Mrs. Rachel stands her ground, while the crowd becomes increasingly vocal in protesting Blake's actions. Soon, more police arrive on the scene. Seeing the agitated crowd and realizing that Blake may have gone too far, one of the officers questions the legality of the arrests after viewing the recorded footage. Blake stands his ground, but the crowd insists that everything was captured on video. The situation intensifies as several journalists, alerted by social media videos, arrive and start asking questions. Blake, now visibly nervous but insistent he's acting within the law, continues to hold James and his team in handcuffs, aware that they are now at the center of a public scandal. Footage of James's arrest quickly spreads on social media, sparking public outrage and condemnation. People flood the comments, demanding justice and calling for local authorities to investigate Sergeant Blake's actions. Soon, local news channels pick up the story, and it receives live coverage. Under mounting public and media pressure, Police Chief Thompson launches an internal investigation. He wants to protect the department's reputation from accusations of racial bias. Thompson summons Blake for a report on the incident, but Blake, feeling trapped, insists he acted lawfully. He claims that James and his team were behaving suspiciously and that he couldn't risk the neighborhood's safety. Meanwhile, activists who saw the video organize a rally outside the police station, demanding justice and the release of James and his team. Protesters hold signs supporting James and condemning Blake. The protests draw increasing media attention, and soon the story reaches national news outlets. In response, the city's mayor calls for a swift investigation to restore public trust. Under pressure from the police chief and mayor, Chief Thompson releases James and his team on bail to ease public tension. As they leave the station, a crowd of supporters greets them. James thanks them for their support and makes a short speech about standing up against injustice. His words resonate with the crowd, and footage of his speech gains traction on social media. He speaks passionately about the importance of fair treatment, regardless of skin color. Journalists soon dig into Blake's past, uncovering evidence of prior incidents involving racial discrimination, although they had never been made public. The focus shifts beyond James's case to more systemic racial bias within the local police department. Chief Thompson realizes that Blake could jeopardize the department's reputation. The higher-ups demand action, so Thompson temporarily suspends Blake pending the investigation. But Blake, feeling betrayed, claims he's a victim of political pressure and accuses James of exploiting the situation for his own gain. He says he won't remain silent and vows to clear his name. The tension escalates when an activist conducts an independent investigation and publishes accounts from other individuals who have encountered Blake's bias. It soon becomes clear that the issue is more significant and that it affects others beyond just James. The story gains national traction, and civil rights organizations rally in support of James and his team. The city becomes polarized, with most people demanding that Blake be held accountable, while a few attempt to justify his actions, claiming he was just doing his job. But the majority feel outraged and seek justice. Ultimately, the mayor and police chief announce a comprehensive investigation, not only into Blake's conduct, but also into the department as a whole. The chapter ends with James preparing for the next step, sharing his story on television to draw more attention to racial discrimination in law enforcement. James prepares for a national TV interview. Over the past few days, his story has become a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination and police bias, and he intends to use this platform to bring these issues to light. Before the interview, he meets with activists and civil rights organizations who support him and help him outline the key points he wants to address. James knows that his story isn't just about his personal experience, but also about deeply rooted issues in law enforcement. As James steps onto the studio stage, he begins speaking about how the system, meant to protect, is often used for intimidation and discrimination. He recounts his arrest, describing how Blake treated him and his team as if they were already guilty. James emphasizes that such incidents aren't rare, and that many people face bias daily. His words resonate widely, and viewers admire his courage. Meanwhile, Chief Thompson and police leaders continue their investigation. More people come forward with stories of past unjust detentions by Blake. Journalists uncover several more incidents where Blake displayed obvious bias, especially toward black individuals. Under pressure, the city's mayor initiates an independent review of the entire police department to identify and eliminate systemic biases. Sergeant Blake, realizing his career is at risk, issues a statement defending his actions, claiming he always acted in the interest of safety. However, his attempt at justification only worsens public perception, as people see his words as showing a lack of remorse or understanding. Following this, the police department decides to terminate Blake and announces that he will forfeit his pension benefits. In the meantime, mass protests break out across the city, supported by locals and people from other cities who have learned about James's case. News outlets cover the protests extensively, and the issue of systemic bias in policing receives increasing attention nationwide. In response, the mayor announces police reform initiatives, including tolerance and fairness training for officers. For James, this is not just a victory over one police officer, but a symbol of larger change. He realizes that his fight is just beginning, and with the activists, he launches a campaign to promote fair treatment in policing, aiming to bring attention to each instance of discrimination and advocate for systemic changes. The story ends with James standing outside the animal shelter, supported by community members. Mrs. Rachel and the volunteers applaud and thank him for his bravery, saying his story has inspired many. Despite personal hardships and injustice, James knows he has managed to defend himself and his team, sparking a movement that could give others a chance at a better future. The final scene shows James and his volunteers returning to their duties at the shelter, greeted warmly by the animals. He knows there's still much work ahead, but he now feels the support and belief in justice that resonates with people across the city and beyond.